As long as Judith is here in this house, I don't need you anymore. I have no intention of supporting you with Judith's money. Leave right now." I had always felt that my mother wasn't interested in me. Despite that, I kept trying my best, believing that someday she would accept me. But I was mistaken. Toxic parents never change. So I gave up hope and left the house. I never imagined that later on, she would ask me for help. I am Christy, 38 years old. I'm still unmarried and living at my parents' house. In my 20s, I wanted to get married, but now it seems impossible. One reason is my weak health. I'm not suffering from any major illness, but I often feel unwell over minor issues. I catch colds frequently and often run a high fever, making it difficult for me to work full-time. Part-time jobs are my limit, but even then, I often have to take days off due to a sudden illness, so I'm not working regularly. This naturally leads to spending more time at home. Recently, I've started working from home, which reduces the burden of commuting. However, my mother seems to think I'm just shutting myself in my room. Since we live together, it's hard to tell her not to interfere. Being unable to work full-time, I am grateful to be able to stay at my family home. Thus, I endure her sarcasm and try to be patient. However, I cover all the utility bills and I pay the property tax for our house. I also handle the repair costs for our long-lived-in home. I don't pay for all the groceries, but I bear a significant part of the costs. Since my father passed away 3 years ago, I have been paying these expenses to avoid burdening my mother. In addition to that, I handle the household chores. When I'm feeling unwell, I do rely on my mother, but normally cooking, laundry, and cleaning are always my responsibilities. Yet my mother still voices her dissatisfaction. How long do I have to take care of a daughter like this at home? I don't remember raising you to be this way. She often complains, distorting her face in disapproval. Honestly, even now, past the age of 30, I think it must be a burden to still be living at my parents'. However, I cover most of the living expenses and take care of everything at home when I am well. Yet, I sometimes wonder if it's really necessary for her to express such discontent. I would think that life should be somewhat easier for her. There wasn't much money left by my father, practically just this house. Moreover, the pension she started receiving in her 60s isn't much. Still, the fact that she can buy what she likes and enjoy her retirement freely is because I support her. Is it selfish of me to wish she would understand this more? Why is it that my beloved Judith left this house, and you, who doesn't matter, are always here? I wish Judith would come back home, my mother would say aloud, intending for me to hear. Judith is my younger sister, 3 years my junior. Unlike me, she is healthy, has a beautiful face, and is academically talented. My mother is proud of Judith and feels she can show her off to anyone. I have always been compared to her and disliked by my mother. To me, my mother was a terrible presence. The differences in clothes, meals, and even the way she interacted with us were clear. To my mother, I was like air, while Judith was treated as her only daughter. Despite such circumstances, the reason I was able to grow up without rebelling is because of my father. He would admonish my mother and showered me with the affection that she did not. If it weren't for my father, I might not have made it to this day. After he passed away, my mother felt lost and even began to depend on me. So despite my poor health, I worked hard at household chores for her sake. But now that she has fully recovered, it seems my efforts are viewed as pointless. Every day, she just asks, "When are you leaving?" Sometimes I think about moving out and living on my own, but then she says, "Make sure you send money home every month. You need to repay the favor for all the care I've given you." Hearing this makes it hard for me to decide to live on my own. Moreover, she says, "After you move out, you still need to come over to do the chores. You're not married and have plenty of time, so it wouldn't hurt you to do that." Living alone while sending money home and managing household chores seems impossible. Listening to my mother's complaints every day only worsens my health. Yet, I cannot bring myself to leave her. So ultimately, I spend each day pained by her words. One day, my sister, who was married and had left home, came to visit. Her 6-year-old daughter was with her. I thought she had just come to show her face after a long time. But then she made a shocking statement. "From today, we'll be living here." From today? What happened? Responding to my question, she surprised me further. "I got divorced and moved out." "What?" "You got divorced." "That's what I just said." "Why did you get divorced?" "Living together brings various issues. The condo is in my husband's name, so I can't live there anymore. There must be reasons for my sister's abrupt divorce and departure. I can quit my current hospital job, but there are plenty of other places to work. Every hospital needs doctors, after all. We'll pay for our own living expenses, so it should be fine. Not only is my sister, Judith, beautiful, but she's also smart and became a doctor. There's no doubt that she doesn't have to worry about money. Surely I'll find a new job soon enough, and then I won't be home much, so I'll leave the housework to you, big sis Judith declared. She walked in and headed straight to the living room, saying, "I'm starving." She arrived just as I finished preparing dinner. When I hurried back to the living room, they had already started eating. My mother, sister, and niece were all sitting around the table. There was no place for me. In fact, my meal wasn't even prepared. Originally, I had only prepared enough for my mother and myself. Surely they must have divided that between the three of them. "This is delicious," my sister said, unconcerned about me. "I'm so happy to see your face. Don't hold back, eat plenty." With her favorite daughter back, my mother was in a great mood, completely disregarding me. My niece quietly progressed through her meal, looking tired and sleepy. This scene felt strangely familiar, and suddenly, memories of the past came flooding back. It was the same view I always saw when my father was away on business trips. When he was not around, my mother took the opportunity to ignore me. She and my sister would sit at the table, disregarding not only my seat but my very existence. Remembering the past, I almost burst into tears. I went out to buy my own dinner. Unlike back then, having the money to buy my own food now felt like a salvation. Thinking of my beloved father, I walked slowly, tears streaming down my face. And so began my life with my sister and her daughter. It's not that I'm particularly at odds with my sister, Judith, but I feel she is favored by our mother, and she treats me with disdain. Consequently, she treats me like a maid, saying things like, "Big sis, please clean the room. I'm working, so you handle the house stuff," she says while lounging on the sofa. Even though she claims she's working, it didn't seem like she had found a formal job yet. When I asked her what she planned to do, she snapped back a bit angrily. "It's no use telling you. There are plenty of jobs for a doctor. I've been working nonstop until now, so let me relax a bit." "Okay, but what about living expenses?" "You're so annoying. I'll pay you back once I start working. You're always nagging about money," she retorted, and I was left speechless. Due to habits formed in childhood, I find it difficult to speak up to my mother and sister. I can't rely on my mother's pension, and my sister insists she'll pay once she starts working, yet she contributes nothing financially. Thus, I end up bearing the cost of living, alone. Additionally, all the household chores are my responsibility, while the two of them just laze around. I thought about sending my niece to kindergarten, but was told, "She'll start elementary school soon, there's no need. Big sis can play with her." Watching the two of them idly, I was the only one burdened with all responsibilities and could only sigh. I live through hectic days daily. Even if I feel slightly unwell, neither of them shows any sign of taking over the household duties. Since Judith started living with us, my mother has completely stopped doing any housework. She only seems to enjoy chatting with Judith. They don't seem to care about me at all. Why am I even doing this? No one listened to my words. Still, There was no sign of Judith looking for a job. When I asked when she was going to start working, my sister only got angry, making it difficult for me to ask again. Seeing her say she was going for a job interview and leave the house made me feel a bit relieved. As I returned to my room with a sense of relief and started reading the newspaper, an article caught my eye. Can this be real? It's not a dream, right? Startled by the sudden development, I jumped when I heard a knock at the door. Could it be my sister? Maybe she came to hurry me for dinner preparation, but it seemed too early for that. While I was pondering this, Christy, open the door. Hurry up, my mother yelled angrily. I had locked the door because I didn't want things to get stolen, but hesitated to open it as my mother seemed very angry. However, I couldn't just leave it locked, so when I opened the door, my mother was standing there with a furious expression. What have you been doing? You know Judith is out for a job interview, don't you? I know, so. If you know, then get out of this house right now. I was shocked when my mother suddenly demanded something outrageous. What do you mean? Don't make me say it again. Get out. Incredibly, my mother was telling me to leave the house. Why should I? You're no longer needed here. You're really slow to catch on. What? Why? Despite all my efforts for the family, even when I wasn't feeling well, I managed the household chores, and now I'm no longer needed? What are you even doing? Always holed up at home using your health as an excuse not to work. I am working from home. I contribute money and I do the chores. People who are useless are no longer needed in this house. With such a definitive statement, I found myself unable to argue back. As long as Judith is here in this house, I don't need you anymore. I have no intention of supporting you with Judith's money. Leave right now. Hearing my mother's words, I felt something inside me crumble. My efforts meant nothing. Both my mother and sister could easily cast me aside. Finally, I came to a realization. No, it was more of a confirmation. It was futile to hope they would understand my efforts or share my feelings. Hoping for anything from these people was pointless. I understand. I'll leave the house. At that moment, I pictured my father's face. It's okay to end this, right, Dad? Did I do my best? I asked him silently in my heart. It felt as if he nodded back apologetically, giving me the push I needed to make a decision. I will leave the house immediately. It's a relief. I never needed a daughter like you in the first place. My mother's harsh words no longer had the power to hurt me. Soon, I would be free and liberated. I had no regrets about this house, and no reason to cling to it. So I simply nodded and began to prepare to leave. What followed happened very quickly. I quickly found a new place to live, and luckily, it met all my requirements. I signed the contract immediately and proceeded with the moving arrangements. Finally, the day of the move arrived. Finally the nuisance is gone. Don't ever come back, my mother said, laughing. My sister also laughed and said, enjoy your poor single life. Don't you dare ask for money. After all, family is just like strangers. I had nothing more to say to them. Calmly, I said only goodbye and left the house. My new life was surprisingly comfortable. The time at my family home felt like a distant dream, and I was living comfortably without any hardships. I hardly ever fell ill anymore. Although I still occasionally ran a fever, my health was much better compared to when I was at my parents' house. Just when I thought my peaceful days would continue, I received a call from my mother. Christy, can you help me? Not knowing what had happened, I agreed to meet her. We arranged to meet at a cafe near the station. What could have happened? It had been only 2 months since I moved out. Had something happened at home? As I walked to the cafe, filled with worry, I soon found myself in front of it. Entering the cafe, I saw that my mother had already been seated. What's the urgency? Please, I need your help. She pleaded as I took my seat. Her face drew close with a worried expression. So explain properly. I demanded, a bit angrily. Perhaps surprised by my assertiveness, my mother suddenly started crying. Judith has been terrible. I can't live with her anymore. My mother's voice was almost like a scream. She continued, sniffling. She lied about going to job interviews. She wasn't going to interviews at all. What do you mean by lies? I asked for clarification. Crying, my mother explained that instead of going to job interviews, Judith had actually been going out to have fun. I heard she was meeting a man outside, she exclaimed. What? I was stunned, but my mother went on. And it turns out she wasn't really working even after she got married. How is that possible? Wasn't she working at a hospital? That's what she lied about. She was secretly seeing another man without her husband knowing. When he found out, it led to their divorce. It looks like her ex-husband will be getting custody of their daughter. They're in the middle of negotiations. Is that really true? It's shocking, right? It was unthinkable. I had never imagined that my sister wasn't actually a doctor. She's not showing any remorse about the divorce or the alimony she has to pay. In fact, she seems to be enjoying herself. Isn't that awful? That is terrible. I found it unbelievable, yet somehow believable at the same time. During our time together, I had noticed that Judith tended to avoid inconvenient situations and had a high sense of pride. It was hard to believe that she could have sustained the mentally demanding job of a doctor. Was it possible that she hadn't been working at all since her marriage? How her ex-husband hadn't noticed sooner was beyond me. So she got divorced because she was eventually found out. Did she really think she could use her husband's money so freely without getting caught? I am at a loss for words over Judith's recklessness. Can she even afford to pay the divorce settlement without any money? She's saying that since she has no money, I should pay it for her. Hearing that, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. My sister, who has no intention of working, is trying to dump everything on our mother. My pension is small, and there's hardly any cash left from your dad's estate. It's impossible to pay. My mother began to cry again. She doesn't do any housework or cleaning at home either. Why not? It seems she never did it before. Her husband didn't know, but it looks like she hired a maid secretly. And then, most of his money was gone, and everything came out. That's actually funny. I couldn't help but laugh. Who is she to talk? Mom, you did something similar by making me do all the household chores. Don't lump me together with Judith. What's the difference, I wonder? My mother continues to surprise me. So, what does that have to do with me? Please come back home. I won't return. It's obvious. You're abandoning me? Have you forgotten all the care I provided at home? My mother's face turned red suddenly, her emotions escalating when she heard my unexpected refusal. This is why you're not endearing. Even though I took care of you as a mother, you're such an ungrateful daughter. While I silently listened to my mother's words, I quietly grasped a glass on the table. You have no right to refuse. You need to come back home immediately, do the chores, and clean. And don't forget about the money. There's a lot to be done, so instead of complaining, you should hurry back and get to it. I couldn't wait until the end. With a swift motion, I splashed the water from the glass I was holding onto my mother's splash. In that instant, she fell silent. The surroundings became deathly quiet. Only the sound of dripping water echoed inside the cafe. My mother's face, shocked and trembling, was a sight to behold. Sorry about that. My hand slipped, I said. As I spoke, I reached for my mother's glass. Just a moment. As if she wanted to say wait, I splashed her again. Water hit directly into her mouth as she was about to speak, causing her to choke. Cough. Cough. What are you doing? Cough. It slipped again. My apologies. I quickly apologized to the approaching waiter and used a towel I had to wipe the wet areas. The waiter brought a mop and cleaned the floor. After apologizing again, I turned to look at my mother. Staring in disbelief, I tossed the towel I was holding at her. "Why don't you wipe yourself off? What are you doing?" "I'm soaking wet." I could catch a cold from being this wet. What does it matter if you catch a cold? What did you just say? Enough. This is how I always felt. My mother continued to scream. I raised my voice, determined not to be outdone. At that moment, the cafe fell silent again. Regretting the escalation, but needing to make my point, I lowered my voice and began to explain to my shocked mother. When I was little, I always had to bathe in cold water. I could only use small towels, and hair dryers were forbidden, so I was always shivering. The situation didn't change even when I became an adult. The days Dad was home were better, but the days he wasn't were even worse. Weren't they? And after Dad died, you know very well what happened. My mother had only allowed me to use small towels and never let me touch the hairdryer. It's no wonder I was always in poor health. That was certainly true. Since I started living on my own, I hadn't been sick once. Initially, I thought it was because the stress from my mother and sister was gone, but I began to realize it wasn't just that. The root cause was my mother. Who would return to a home with someone like you? I've taken care of you all these years, so it's only natural you should listen to your parent. Like I said earlier, you haven't taken care of me at all. What? Unlike before, I spoke back firmly, and my mother gradually stumbled over her words. I don't remember you raising me at all. It was Dad who raised me. Without him, I wouldn't be who I am today. What you did was not care, it was abuse. That's not true. After Dad died, I've paid back more than enough over these 3 years. I worked hard doing household chores even on days when I felt sick. Have you ever once cared about my health? It was because of me that you could live comfortably, right? Who's thanks to? It's thanks to Christy. So, you understand why I said I won't come back. I understand, but... Still, further conversation seemed pointless. I quietly stood up from my seat. Wait, we haven't finished talking, have we? Living alone is tough, we could live together, so... I forgot to mention. I cut off my mother's attempt to persuade me and showed her a photo on my phone. What's this photo supposed to mean? Look closely. It's a luxury apartment. So what? This is my home. What? My mother exclaimed as I revealed my surprising life in a luxury apartment. That's your place? You can't possibly have the money for that. Actually, I won the lottery. What did you say? I've always thought I had a terrible life, but God didn't abandon me, who lived honestly. The day you told me to get out of the house, that day's newspaper had the winning numbers. That was when I saw the numbers in the newspaper and thought, can this be real? Is it not a dream? With this money, I was able to buy the apartment. I still have plenty of money, but I'm saving it properly and earning my own living expenses. I don't have to worry about getting sick anymore, and I can work now. In just this short period. 2 months is enough. My mother seemed at a loss for words. So please don't contact me anymore. I have no intention of meeting you or Judith ever again. Goodbye. As I started to leave, my astonished mother hastily clung to me. Wait. I apologize for everything before. Please don't abandon me. Smiling, I responded to her plea. Judith once said that family is ultimately just strangers, so to me you are now a stranger. Leaving those words behind, I walked out of the cafe. My mother was left speechless, completely hollowed out. A few days later, my mother called again, demanding, "Let me live together with you." But I immediately refused. Judith also contacted me saying, "I'm having a hard time with Mom. You should take care of the house and contribute money." I rejected her request as well. Family is just strangers, right? I said, and hung up the phone. I then blocked both my mother's and sister's numbers. I later heard from relatives that Judith is still unemployed. She has run out of money for going out and is just staying at home. My mother, having no interest in housework, let the house quickly become a mess. My niece was taken in by her ex-husband. With funds depleted, my mother had no choice but to sell the house. It's an old family home, located in the countryside, so the land wasn't worth much. My mother and sister moved into an old apartment with the little money they had left. It seems their money vanished quickly. My mother has been begging relatives for money. Eventually, even the relatives disowned her, and she now leads a lonely and impoverished life with my sister. My sister still refuses to work, which may very well be a consequence of my mother's excessive coddling. As for me, I've been completely liberated from my mother and sister and am enjoying peaceful days. My health is good, and both my work and personal life are fulfilling. Recently, I've had a new development in my life. Would you consider dating me with marriage in mind? A serious-looking man asked me, and now we are in a relationship. We plan to marry next year. I'm going to be happy, I said, speaking to a photo of my father, and it felt as if he smiled back at me. Children are a nuisance, so go to a facility. I don't have a mother anymore. My name is Elaine Gray. I'm still in the 5th grade of elementary school, and I live with my father and mother in a family of 3. My father is very warm and often takes me out on holidays. My mother acts normal when my father is around, but when he's not, she can be cold and hard to approach. I'm off. As usual, my father headed to work early in the morning. While eating breakfast, I called out, "Take care." Looking at the clock, it was almost time to go to school. I hurried to finish my breakfast and rushed to change my clothes. Thank you for the meal. After finishing, I put the dishes in the sink and headed back to my room to change. Just a moment. My mother called me back, and when I turned around, she was pointing at the sink. Who is going to wash these? Her eyes were stern, and she seemed angry. Normally, I would just change and go to school, but I felt like I would be scolded if I did that. I'll wash them myself. When I said this in a small voice, my mother suddenly yelled, "What? I can't hear you." My body jolted. However, feeling that I was wrong, I apologized. "I'm sorry. I'll wash them myself." Hoon. That's right. From now on, take care of your own things. With anger, my mother threw her apron onto the sofa and went back to her room. Reflecting on her words, I realized that I need to manage things myself, so I cleaned up after breakfast and left the house. While talking with friends at school, the topic of parents came up. Listening to them, their mothers seem kind, and although they sometimes get angry, their relationships appear good. What's your mom like, Elaine? I was suddenly asked, and I hesitated on how to respond. However, I thought that maybe my perception of my mother being cold was a misunderstanding and that she was irritable because I had been neglecting my responsibilities, so I answered that she is very kind. My friends responded with, "That's nice, but I felt conflicted." When I got home and said, "I'm back," there was no sign of my mother. Thinking she might have gone shopping, I started my homework in my room. Before I knew it, it was completely dark outside, and the clock indicated it was dinner time, but my mother still hadn't returned. After a while, I heard noises at the entrance and sounds of something being moved and the fridge opening. When I peeked into the kitchen from my room's door, I saw my mother. Feeling hungry, I approached the kitchen and greeted her with, "Welcome back." "I'm back." From her brief reply without turning around, I could tell she was still in a bad mood. "What's for dinner tonight?" I asked with a smile, but it seemed to be a mistake. My mother turned around with a frightening expression. "What? Didn't I tell you to take care of your own things?" Your dad will be home soon, and I'm busy preparing dinner." Unable to say anything more, I reluctantly started to make instant noodles just as my father came home. "I'm home." Hearing my father's voice, my mother immediately took the instant noodles I was holding. While I was disoriented by her actions, my father entered the kitchen. "Oh, are we just starting dinner now?" Seeing my gentle father's face, I felt tears welling up. "Welcome back. Today, shopping took a bit long, so I'm about to start making dinner now. Daddy and Elaine, please wait a little longer." My mother's face softened. I wasn't sure if she was no longer angry, but the thought of eating the meal she was preparing made me feel happy. Later we had dinner as a family and had a fun time playing games with my father. Maybe my mother was still a bit in a bad mood. As I fell asleep, I thought that if I properly took care of my own things, I wouldn't get scolded anymore. From the next day, I made an effort to manage my own affairs. I washed the dishes after breakfast, folded the laundry myself, and put it away in the closet. I cleaned my room, and on days when my mother was late, I prepared and ate instant noodles by myself. Hoping for a compliment from my mother, my face naturally brightened. Although she hasn't praised me yet, she has been getting angry less often. It's enjoyable to spend happy times with my father and the three of us as a family when he is home. One night, I woke up to groaning sounds and realized it was the middle of the night. Feeling scared and thinking it might be a ghost, I covered myself with my blanket. The groaning continued, and soon, trembling with fear, I heard the sound of an ambulance siren. The ambulance stopped very close to our house, and the front of the house became noisy. For the first time, I realized an ambulance had stopped in front of our house. I jumped out of bed in a panic and saw that it was my father being carried out by the paramedics. "Daddy," I cried out, seeing his face pale and in pain. Tears overflowing, I clung to a paramedic and pleaded, "Please save my dad." The paramedic gently placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll take him to the hospital right away." Afterward, my mother and I followed in the ambulance to the hospital, and upon arrival, my father was quickly taken to the treatment room. All we could do was wait in the designated area. As we waited, anxiety dominated my mind, wondering what I would do if my father were to pass away. Next to me, my mother calmly operated her smartphone, showing no outward signs of worry. While shedding tears, I anxiously waited for someone to reassure me that everything would be all right. It's unclear how much time passed, but eventually, a doctor came to us. While my mother and the doctor discussed something complex, all I could understand was that a serious illness had been discovered in my father, and he would need to stay in the hospital for a while. Though the worst-case scenario might have been avoided, the fact that my father had to fight this illness pained my heart. I also had to accept the reality that he wouldn't be able to come home for some time. We decided to go home for the time being. My mother quickly prepared everything needed for my father's hospital stay and headed back to the hospital. Left alone at home, I lay in bed unable to sleep, and since I had come home early in the morning, it soon started to get light outside. I need to go to school. I knew I had to go to school, but my heart wasn't in it at all. I had no appetite and just lay still in bed. "Aren't you going to school?" It was noon by the time my mother noticed I hadn't gone. Although my mother didn't scold me for skipping school, she needed to visit the hospital and hurriedly left the house. Having not eaten anything since the morning, I headed to the kitchen. There was some rice left in the rice cooker and some leftovers from the previous night's dinner in the fridge, so I made a meal using those. In the evening, when my mother returned home, she had bought some sandwiches for me. Eat this today. Also, I bought some instant noodles, so have those from tomorrow. Okay, thank you. With my mother busy due to my father's situation, I decided to follow her instructions to not cause her any trouble. The next morning, I had instant noodles for breakfast and went to school. When my friends asked why I was absent the day before, I dodged the question by saying I was feeling unwell. The teacher seemed to understand my situation and spoke kindly to me. When I got home, my mother was not there, probably at the hospital with my father. Thinking about it, I started on my homework. I wanted to visit my father too, and planned to ask my mother if we could go together on the next holiday. While I was doing my homework, the phone rang, and since no one else was home, I decided to answer it. Hello. Elaine, is that you? What are you doing? It was my father on the other end, and hearing his voice made tears spill over. Dad. Are you okay? I want to see you. As I cried, my father spoke kindly and with a smile in his voice. I'm sorry for worrying you. There's no problem now. Dad wants to see you. I'd like you and Mom to come visit. Yeah. I'll talk to Mom about it. That's good. Is Mom there with you? I was a bit puzzled by my father's question. Mom wasn't at home, and I thought she might be at the hospital. Mom isn't here. Maybe she's at the hospital. When I responded, it seemed like my father realized something and began to speak in a roundabout way. I see, that's right. I just got home a little while ago. I think she'll be back soon. Elaine, are you eating properly? Yeah, Mom bought some instant noodles for me, so I'm okay. After my reply, there was a brief silence from my father before he changed the subject with a simple I see. After the conversation with my dad, I heard the front door open, signaling my mom's return. Dad had asked to speak with Mom, so I handed the phone to her when she got home. Mom seemed a bit shaken as she took the phone and talked with Dad. When Mom came home, I could smell tobacco on her, making me wonder where she had been before returning to her room. The next day, when I asked Mom if we could go to the hospital together, she made a complex expression but eventually agreed to take me. The reunion with my father had been a long time coming. He was connected to an IV, but as soon as he saw me, he showed a big smile. Elaine, I'm so glad you came. I instinctively hugged my father, nearly crying at the sight of him looking so energetic, but I felt very happy. After enjoying a conversation with my father, I left the hospital room as it was time for my mother to return. As I looked back, my father was waving his hand with a smile, saying, "Come visit again." Little did I know that this would be our last conversation. Soon after, my father's condition suddenly worsened, and he passed away. I couldn't believe the reality and dressed in black as my mother instructed, attending the funeral. Many people gathered at the funeral to say their goodbyes to my father. My mother was composed throughout, and watching her, I almost hallucinated that my father was still alive. As I was standing absently in a corner of the venue, someone approached me. "Hey, aren't you Elaine?" Turning around, I saw a woman dressed rather flamboyantly standing there. Confused about who she was, the woman sat next to me and began to speak. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? I'm your aunt, your father's sister." Now that she mentioned it, I could see the resemblance to my father. I didn't know about my aunt, but I had heard my father mention his sister. "Aunt." "Yes, aunt?" "Don't you think I look like your father?" she said with a laugh, and her face was indeed very much like my father's. At that moment, my aunt suddenly hugged me tightly. "It's okay to cry, Elaine. You've done well," she said, and without realizing it, my tears began to flow even more. It felt like I truly accepted the reality that I would never see my father again at that moment. After my aunt gently stroked my back and I calmed down a bit, I thanked her, and then went to get a drink. In the room, I found my mother, who coldly remarked upon seeing my tear-streaked face. "Were you crying? How disgraceful." Her cold words pierced my heart. "Mom, aren't you sad?" I asked, shocked that she seemed not to be grieving at all. "Being sad won't change anything. He's gone now," my mother answered coldly. Her cold words made my body start to tremble. Even though the three of us had always laughed and had fun when my father was around, I wondered if my mother had truly hated him. As I stood frozen, my aunt appeared. "Oh, sister-in-law, long time no see," my aunt said cheerfully, but my mother's expression immediately changed. "Oh, it's been a while." "Do you need any help?" my aunt asked, to which my mother replied, "No, there's nothing." Well then, Elaine, let's go over there," my aunt suggested. She took my hand and we left the room. I could tell from my mother's expression that she felt uncomfortable around my aunt. Afterward, I spent time by my aunt's side, and the funeral ended without incident. "Elaine, we're leaving now," my mother called me after the funeral. My aunt had held my hand throughout the funeral, but she let go when it was time to leave. Her expression was a bit sad. "Elaine, see you again." "Yeah, see you," I replied. As I followed my mother outside, an unfamiliar car was parked there. "Sorry to keep you waiting," my mother said as she opened the car door. An unfamiliar man was in the driver's seat, and I felt a resistance to getting into the car unconsciously. "Don't dawdle, get in quickly," my mother urged in a tone I had never heard from her before. Reluctantly, I got into the car, and it started driving in the opposite direction of our home. I continued to stare out the window. Not knowing where we were going, I felt a slight fear inside the car. "We're here. Get out quickly," I was told as I got out of the car, and there stood a large building, a place completely unfamiliar to me. "Mom, where are we?" I asked as my mother lit a cigarette. "Children are a nuisance, so go to a facility." Stunned, I could only utter a confused "A" as my mother and the man drove away in the car. I desperately chased after the car, but eventually tripped and failed to catch up, forcing me to give up the pursuit. As I was heading back to where I had been left, a car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down and my aunt was sitting in the driver's seat. I never expected things to turn out like this. "Elaine, come on, get in." Relieved to see my aunt again, I quickly got into the car. She patted my head, and in response to her kindness, tears quietly started to flow. "How many times will you cry today? Poor thing." After driving for a while, we arrived at a house which seemed to be my aunt's home. As we entered, a man's voice greeted us warmly with welcome back. I instinctively hid behind my aunt, but she laughed and reassured me, "It's okay." As I timidly looked at the person, a young man stood there, smiling warmly at me. "Surprised? Sorry about that. Actually, I'm this lady's husband. So, you can call me Uncle." He extended his hand with a friendly smile. Feeling reassured, I shook his hand, and he smiled again. "You must be hungry, right? Dinner is ready. You need to eat well and grow strong. You're as fussy as a mother." Their light-hearted banter made me laugh, and just then, my stomach growled. I blushed with embarrassment, and they both laughed even more. I was relieved to finally enjoy a fun dinner time, which I had missed for so long. After dinner, a bath was prepared, and pajamas were laid out for me to change into. When I went to the living room, my aunt had prepared some warm milk. "Hot milk, huh? Aren't you a bit too old for that? Right, Elaine? But don't elementary school kids like hot milk? No?" Their playful exchange was so comforting that I couldn't help but laugh along. Led by their laughter, they both began to laugh. "Sit down, I have something to talk about," my uncle said, and as I sat in front of the hot milk, he started speaking. "Hey Elaine, how about becoming our child?" he suddenly proposed, and since I was about to drink my milk, I choked. Cough, cough. "What?" I exclaimed in surprise. Sorry. That was sudden, wasn't it?" my uncle said as he patted my back. My aunt, watching this, laughed heartily. "Why don't you become our child? Do you really want to go back to your mother?" my aunt continued. Her words made me think deeply. I don't hate my mother, but considering the home situation, my father, and being left behind, the thought of returning to her is frightening. "Actually, we had talked to your father about this," my uncle revealed. "What?" Hearing my father's name, I was even more surprised. Then my aunt explained everything in detail. The man my mother was with was her affair partner, and my father knew about the affair. He was very worried about me. As his condition worsened, and he realized he might not have much time left, my father asked them to take care of me after he was gone. Hearing this, tears overflowed, and I desperately missed my father. "Your father loved you very much and cared deeply for you," my aunt said as she gently stroked me, her touch warm and comforting. I silently shouted words of thanks to my father over and over in my mind. I remembered my father, who always played with me and whom I dearly loved. I decided that from now on, I want to become stronger. "I want to stay with you, Aunt and Uncle," I told them, and they were very pleased. Formal procedures are needed for us to officially become a family, and while these will take some time to complete, I was assured that I can stay with them without worry in the meantime. Wanting to be useful for my aunt and uncle, I decided to help with preparing breakfast and dinner and cleaning the bathroom and toilet. But my hard work only seemed to worry my aunt and uncle more. Elementary school kids should be playing more, they said, and though I was confused, I started my homework anyway. "Elaine, have you been doing housework all this time?" my aunt asked me at dinner. When I nodded, my uncle sitting next to me gently hugged me and said, "It must have been tough being just a grade schooler. Elementary school students can help out with chores, but I'm worried it looks like you're overdoing it." Indeed, I might have been excessively trying to earn my mother's praise without even realizing it. I fell silent, realizing this. The praise from my mother that I never received. I felt that my efforts might have meant little to her. You don't need to worry about anything here. You can help out, but what's important is your friends, school, and taking care of yourself. We want you to cherish yourself." My aunt's words resonated deeply with me. My uncle nodded repeatedly, his eyes moist. I strongly felt how happy I was to be with my aunt and uncle. 2 weeks after my father's funeral, I was called to the teacher's room at school. Wondering what it was about, I was told that there was a phone call from my mother. The teacher shouldn't know much about my situation. Thinking that leaving the phone call unattended might trouble the teachers, I picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Hello." "Elaine." "Answer the phone quickly." The voice of my mother, which I hadn't heard in a long time, was shouting. "Where are you right now?" "I called the facility, and they said you aren't there." I choked up, unable to respond. "Are you listening to me? Well, never mind. I'm coming to pick you up because then I'll get the allowance. I need the money right now," my mother said. Hearing her words, I felt myself rapidly regaining composure. The thought of wanting to be loved or praised by someone who had betrayed my father was both frustrating and painful. Now I have my aunt and uncle by my side, and they are precious to me. My beloved father is also watching over me from somewhere. I can become stronger. I don't have a mother anymore. Before I realized it, those words had been directed at my mother. "What? What are you talking about?" my mother retorted. "Are you mistaken? Then, goodbye." Wait a minute before my mother could finish. I had hung up the phone. The teacher present was shocked and asked, "Was that really not your mother?" To which I responded, "That was a stranger." The call was treated as suspicious, and the school issued a caution. Worried that my mother might show up when I was leaving school, I used the school's public phone to contact my aunt. My aunt promised to come and pick me up right away and indeed showed up shortly thereafter. She explained the situation to the school teachers, who decided to contact Child Protective Services. After I got home, my mother did actually come to pick me up, but the teachers handled it, and she left in a bad mood. Although my mother didn't intrude on the school again, considering my safety, my aunt or uncle started picking me up when school ended. While I was grateful for my aunt and uncle's comfort, they encouraged me cheerfully not to worry. With the support of my aunt and uncle, I have been able to lead a happy life. The teachers at school are kind, and I feel supported by many people. One day, the home phone rang. Lately, I have been answering more calls at my aunt's house. As usual, I answered the phone cheerfully with "hello." However, the reply was a voice I did not want to hear. "Oh, isn't this Elaine? I thought you weren't at the facility, but you are there after all." As soon as I heard my mother's voice, I was startled. How did she know I was here? I hadn't told anyone. "Stop staying there and come back soon. Things are tough over here," my mother continued unilaterally. According to my mother, her affair partner's company had gone bankrupt, and she was financially in trouble. Despite hearing my mother's intentions, all I could perceive was her financial dependency on me, which became clear as she continued to plead over the phone. Previously, when she had called the school, she had voiced financial problems, indicating her dire economic situation. As I remained silent, my mother's anger escalated. Amidst her shouting, suddenly my aunt took the phone from me. I turned around to see her smiling, but her expression quickly turned to anger. "Just respond at least." "Are you even listening?" my mother yelled. "It's enough. I can hear you," my aunt responded firmly. My mother's voice trailed off over the phone. My heart was pounding during the confrontation. How can you not be ashamed? Telling your daughter to come back for money, that's no joke. What do you think Elaine is? My aunt confronted her. It's none of your business. Elaine is my daughter, give her back, my mother argued. Why did you leave your daughter in front of a facility then? Stop making convenient arguments, my aunt retorted. I'll call the police. I'll accuse you of kidnapping, my mother threatened. Go ahead, say that. We have evidence of all the terrible things you've done to Elaine. We can share that too. We actually welcome the police. It would resolve things faster, my aunt said assertively. What? My mother screamed, and I felt guilty, as if I was causing more trouble. At that moment, unnoticed by me, my uncle had returned and gently patted my shoulder. It's okay. Leave it to us. This is a matter for adults to resolve. My uncle then took my hand and prepared more hot milk for me. Elaine, you like hot milk, right? You drink it a lot. Yes, it was so delicious the first time I tried it. I just loved it, I replied. Hearing this, my uncle smiled happily. After a while, my aunt came back into the living room and noticed my worried look, tousling my hair as she spoke. What's with that face? There's nothing to worry about. We won't let her win. As I fixed my hair, I expressed my gratitude to them. Later, I helped with the dinner preparations. Living with my aunt and uncle made me realize how enjoyable housework could be. A few days later, another call came from my mother. My aunt and uncle had said there was no need to answer her calls anymore, but I wanted to be useful to them. Elaine? Mom is really in trouble. Help me. I've said this before, but I don't have a mother anymore. How can you be so cold? I raised you. Have you forgotten the fun days with Dad? The moment my mother mentioned Dad, my heart skipped a beat, but anger surged within me. Yes, it was really fun when Dad was around, but only he was kind. You abandoned me. I shouted louder than I expected, feeling a clear sense of relief as I expressed my feelings. After that, I confidently countered her words. You are still my child, aren't you? I didn't abandon you, I just left you temporarily. You laughed and told me that children are a nuisance and to go to a facility. I can't think of someone like that as my mother. That was. I was forced to say that. It's not my fault. But you abandoned me. Therefore, I have no mother. If I have a mother, it's my aunt. My father is my uncle and my dad in heaven. You're brainwashed. Just come back without complaining. At that moment, I was arguing intensely with my mother while shedding tears. However, strangely, my heart felt lighter, as if I had released everything I had been holding back. Then at least tell them to let me live in their house. I can't even eat properly as it is. No, I won't let you disturb my loved ones. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me and turned around to find my aunt and uncle standing there. My aunt patted my shoulder and praised me, saying, "Well done." My uncle, with tears in his eyes, nodded in agreement. Then, my aunt took over the phone and continued talking to my mother. Strangely, she seemed satisfied. My uncle expressed how happy he was that I called him Dad. Receiving his words of gratitude made me feel good about calling him that, and it seemed right to continue. After that, the contacts from my mother ceased. Perhaps it was also thanks to my aunt and uncle's support. Sometime after starting my new life, my aunt surprised me with my first smartphone. Having a smartphone for the first time was exciting, and it helped me stay in touch more frequently with friends. making my life even more enjoyable? One unusual day, amid the long, peaceful days, the house's landline rang. Since the situation with my mother, the school had been mostly contacting my aunt and uncle on their mobile phones, and I usually communicated with my friends through my new smartphone. Wondering who it could be, I answered the phone. "Hello." Contrary to my upbeat voice, a lethargic voice responded. Hello, it's me." At first, I didn't recognize who it was, thinking it might be a wrong number. Having been taught not to talk to strangers over the phone at school, I was about to hang up. "Wait, it's Mom. Have you forgotten my voice? Eh? Ah, now that you mention it." When she pointed out it was her, I listened more closely, and indeed, it was my mother's voice. It was noticeably weaker than before, making it initially hard to recognize. "You're going to be in 6th grade soon, huh?" There's no one here now." My mother started to cry at those words. As I was wondering what to do next, she spoke in a heavy tone. "The thing is, I'm in the hospital. I've gotten sick." I thought of my father, but without sadness instead. I felt grateful for all the good memories he had given me. As my mother pleaded for help with her medical expenses and care, I fell silent. "Say something." "Why should I take care of a stranger like you?" I won't pay your hospital bills, and I won't ask my aunt to either." "Don't get too cocky." Her vigor was surprising for someone who claimed to be ill. Hearing about my mother's illness did not disturb me as it had when my father passed away. My feelings toward her had completely cooled off, and her words no longer instilled fear in me. I simply felt pity for her situation. I never imagined I could respond to my mother with such detachment, but I knew I never wanted to become like her when I grew up. Actually, I've received a new smartphone, and the home landline is hardly used, so it's going to be removed soon. This might really be our final goodbye. Watching her panic, I continued coldly. "Don't end things this way. Then, give me your smartphone number." "I cannot do that." "Isn't there anyone who will help me?" "There's no one to support me." "Then I'll make sure to contact someone who might look after you." Her voice briefly brightened at my words, but I sighed inwardly. Before hanging up, I obtained the name of the hospital and immediately contacted my aunt. When I reported this interaction to my aunt, she praised me for handling the situation on my own. "Can I ask you to handle any further contact?" I asked. My aunt readily agreed and promised to reach out to someone who could handle the situation. A few days later, I noticed the home phone ringing continuously. Assuming it was likely my mother, I deliberately chose not to answer. That night, the home phone kept ringing late into the evening, continuing even after my aunt and uncle returned home. When I informed my aunt that the phone was still ringing, she sighed and picked up the receiver. As expected, it was my mother on the other end, and a heated exchange began between her and my aunt. My mother persistently demanded to speak with me, but my aunt firmly refused. From the other end of the line, it was clear that my mother was infuriated that I had contacted her brother. Indeed, the person I had asked my aunt to contact was my mother's brother, my uncle, whom I remembered my mother disliked. My mother's brother is known for his stubbornness and deep sense of morality, and he would never tolerate my mother's misconduct. Upon hearing from my aunt, he was furious and promised to come immediately. The reunion between the siblings after several years ended disastrously, fueling my mother's anger towards us. Usually calm, my uncle prompted my aunt to hand him the phone when he saw the situation escalating. However, his expression sternly changed as soon as he took the call. "He gets even scarier than me when he's angry," my aunt whispered to me. "Oh, enough. If you want to talk that much, I'll come myself. I'll make you apologize in front of Elaine. Sick or not, it doesn't matter. Be prepared," my uncle shouted. After my uncle's outburst, my mother hung up in shock. "Oops," she hung up. After the call ended, my uncle was smiling as usual. It seems true that when a generally calm person gets angry, it is indeed frightening. Subsequently, my mother was forcibly taken to her brother's home. Her illness turned out to be milder than expected, and she was soon discharged from the hospital. Forced to live and work on her brother's farm, my mother, who had initially planned a lavish lifestyle with her lover, disliked farm work but had no choice but to toil under her brother's stern demands. Without the luxury to afford expensive brands anymore, she began wearing second-hand clothes donated by villagers. Meanwhile, the adoption process with my aunt and uncle was finalized, and I officially became their child. We celebrated with a big party where I laughed heartily. Surprisingly, we learned that next year, a new brother or sister would join our family, which made me incredibly happy and grateful. This experience reaffirmed my desire to cherish what it means to be a family.